The instant I stepped through the mahogany door I knew I had just made either the best decision of my life, or the worst mistake imaginable. Patricia Whitmore's face tightened into something that hovered between a smile and a wince like she'd bitten into a lemon while trying to pose for a photo. Her gaze swept over my simple navy dress, sensible flats and drugstore earrings, and I could practically see her calculating my net worth and deciding I wasn't worth much at all. She leaned toward her son, my fiancé Marcus, and murmured something she clearly thought I couldn't hear. I heard every word. She said I looked like the help who had wandered in through the wrong entrance. That was the moment I knew this dinner was going to be very, very interesting. My name is Ella Graham. I'm 32 years old and I have a confession to make. For the past 14 months I've been keeping a secret from the man I was supposed to marry. Not a small secret like eating the last slice of pizza and blaming it on the dog. Not even a medium one like the fact that I still sleep with a stuffed animal from childhood. No, my secret was that I earn $37,000 a month. Before taxes the number is downright obscene. After taxes it's still high enough to make accountants blink twice and ask if there's been an error. I'm a senior software architect at one of the largest tech companies in the Pacific Northwest. I've been writing code since I was 15, sold my first app at 22, and have been climbing the corporate ladder ever since. I hold 3 patents. I've spoken at international conferences. I have stock options that could make your eyes water. And Marcus thought I was an administrative assistant who could barely afford her rent. I never actually lied to him. When we met at a coffee shop 14 months ago, he asked what I did for a living and I said I worked in tech. He nodded like he understood, then asked if I handled scheduling for the executives. I smiled and gave a vague answer about supporting the team. He filled in the blanks himself, and I never corrected him. Why would I do that? Why would I let the man I was dating, the man I was falling in love with, believe I was struggling financially when I could have bought his car 10 times over? Because I learned something long ago from the most important person in my life. My grandmother raised me after my parents passed away when I was 7. She lived in a modest house on a quiet street, drove an older car, shopped at ordinary grocery stores, and never wore anything flashy. She taught me how to cook simple meals, how to enjoy small pleasures, and how never to measure my worth by the number in my bank account. What I didn't know until she died, when I was 24, was that my grandmother had been worth several $1,000,000. She had built a small business empire in her youth, invested with care, and chosen a simple life because she believed character mattered far more than appearances. When she passed, she left everything to me, along with a letter I still keep tucked inside my nightstand drawer. In it she wrote something I've never forgotten. She said a person's true character reveals itself only when they believe no one important is watching. When they think you have nothing to offer them. When they assume you're beneath their notice. That, she wrote, is when you see who they really are. So when Marcus invited me to dinner at his parents' estate, when he hinted this might be the night things became serious, when he mentioned that his mother was extremely particular about first impressions, I made a decision. I would give the Whitmore family the same test my grandmother had taught me. I would arrive exactly as they expected me to, simple and unassuming. I would wear modest clothes, drive my old car, and speak humbly about my circumstances. And I would watch how they treated someone they believed couldn't help them. Someone they thought was beneath them. Someone they assumed had nothing to offer. And before you judge me, before you decide I was being manipulative or dishonest, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what your partner's family truly thinks of you? Have you ever sensed that the smiles were forced and the compliments hollow? Have you ever wanted the truth even if it might hurt? I wanted to know. I needed to know. Because I wasn't just considering marrying Marcus, I was considering marrying into his family. And families, as my grandmother also taught me, are forever. Now, before I continue, I just want to pause for a moment. If you're enjoying this so far, please hit the like button and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love reading those messages, seeing people tuning in from all over the world at every hour. It means more to me than you know. Okay, back to the story. The Whitmore estate was exactly what I expected, and yet it still managed to shock me with its excess. The driveway alone was longer than some streets I've lived on. The gates were wrought iron trimmed with gold because apparently plain iron wasn't pretentious enough. The lawn was manicured with such precision it looked as though someone had measured each blade of grass with a ruler. As I guided my 12-year-old Subaru Outback up that immaculate drive, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Simple makeup. Hair pulled back into a low ponytail. My grandmother's small gold studs, the only jewelry I wore. I looked exactly like someone who didn't belong there. Perfect. Marcus greeted me at the door with a kiss that felt oddly performative, as though it were meant for an audience. His eyes flicked over my dress, my shoes, my lack of accessories, and for the first time I noticed something in his expression I'd never seen before. Embarrassment. He was embarrassed by how I looked. I noted it carefully and tucked it away for later. Inside the house was a shrine to new money doing its best impression of old money. Crystal chandeliers glittered from every ceiling. Oil paintings in heavy gilded frames covered the walls, prints I noticed, not originals. The furniture was undeniably expensive and equally uninviting, chosen for how it photographed rather than how it felt. Everything was designed to impress, nothing to comfort. And there, standing in the foyer like a monarch surveying her domain, was Patricia Whitmore. She was in her early 60s, with a face that spoke of excellent surgeons and regular maintenance. Her blonde hair was sculpted into a flawless helmet that likely required industrial-strength hairspray to survive the evening. Her dress was designer, her jewelry undeniably real, and her smile was perfectly unmistakably fake. She extended her hand to me as though granting an audience. I took it and felt the limpness, the dismissal, the complete absence of warmth. Then she made that comment to Marcus, the one about me looking like the help, and I smiled politely and pretended not to hear a word. The evening was already shaping up to be very interesting. If I'd known what awaited me that night, I might have worn armor instead of a navy dress. But I've always believed the best armor is information, and I had done my homework. The Whitmore family owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 states. Not the flashy luxury brands you see in movies, but respectable mid-range vehicles marketed to ordinary families. Marcus's father Harold had inherited the business from his own father and spent the last 30 years expanding it. Patricia married into the family at 23 and immediately began climbing the social ladder with the focus of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. They had 2 children. Marcus, my fiancé, was 34 and worked as a marketing manager at a company entirely unrelated to the family business, a decision that, according to every subtle hint I'd uncovered, deeply disappointed Harold, who had expected his son to take over the dealerships. And then there was Vivian, the older sister, 38, who treated the family fortune like her personal piggy bank. I learned all of this through public records, social media, and a few carefully targeted Google searches. I'd seen photos of extravagant parties, society events, and charity galas. I'd read glowing articles about Patricia's philanthropy, though a closer look revealed that most donations came neatly packaged with tax breaks and publicity opportunities. Still, none of that prepared me for meeting Vivian in person. She arrived 20 minutes late, a habit I would later learn was entirely intentional. Making an entrance mattered more to her than respecting anyone else's time. She swept into the living room wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, diamonds dripping from her ears and neck as though she'd fallen into a jewelry store and emerged coated in merchandise. Her greeting to me was a single word delivered with the warmth of a frozen fish. Hello. Not hello, nice to meet you. Just hello. Not hello, Marcus has told us so much about you. Just hello, delivered with a faint curl of her lip as though she'd caught an unpleasant smell. I smiled and returned the greeting. She immediately turned to her mother and launched into a conversation that deliberately excluded me discussing an upcoming charity event and whether the florist had been fired yet for last month's disaster. I stood there holding the glass of water I'd been handed, feeling about as welcome as a vegetarian in a steakhouse. Marcus hovered nearby, visibly uncomfortable, but said nothing. That was the second observation I carefully filed away. Harold Whitmore was an entirely different sort of presence. He was a large man who had likely been athletic in his younger years before giving in to the indulgences of wealth. His handshake was firm in intention but weary in execution. His eyes, however, were sharp, and I noticed him studying me with something that resembled curiosity. There was another guest at the table, someone I hadn't expected. An older gentleman named Richard Hartley, introduced as a longtime family friend and business associate. He was in his late 60s with silver hair and piercing eyes that seemed to miss nothing. When he shook my hand, his gaze lingered with a flicker of recognition that unsettled me. Had we met before? I couldn't place him, and he said nothing, but throughout the evening I caught him watching me with the same puzzled expression. Patricia led us into the dining room, which looked as though someone had been given an unlimited budget and absolutely no taste. The table was long enough to host a royal banquet. The chairs were upholstered in what I assumed was real silk, and each place setting held more forks than I'd ever seen outside a restaurant supply catalog. I counted them. 6 forks. For one meal. I'd seen surgical procedures performed with fewer instruments. Patricia noticed my glance and offered that frozen smile of hers. She remarked that she supposed I wasn't accustomed to formal dining, her voice coated in artificial sympathy. I replied that my grandmother had always taught me it wasn't the forks that mattered, but the company you shared the meal with. Her smile tightened just a fraction. Vivian snorted into her wine glass and dinner began. The first course was a soup I couldn't identify, but one that likely cost more per bowl than my weekly grocery bill. Patricia used the opportunity to begin what I would later think of as the interrogation. She asked where I had grown up. I said a small town in Oregon. True. She asked about my family. I said my grandmother raised me. Also true. She asked what my parents did. I told her they had passed away when I was young. Patricia made a noise that was meant to sound sympathetic, but came out more like a drain struggling to unclog. She remarked on how difficult it must have been to grow up without proper guidance. I replied that my grandmother had given me all the guidance I ever needed. Vivian leaned forward, her diamonds catching the chandelier's light. She asked what my grandmother had done for a living. I said she'd been a businesswoman. Vivian's eyebrows lifted slightly as she pressed further, asking what kind of business. I answered that she'd run small ventures, nothing particularly exciting. The truth, of course, was that my grandmother had built a company she later sold for several $1,000,000. But that was not the kind of truth that would serve me tonight. Patricia smoothly shifted the conversation. She asked about my current job. I said I worked in tech. She asked if I was a secretary. I replied that I was more of a support role. Patricia nodded with thin satisfaction, as though I just confirmed every assumption she'd already made. She said it was nice, every team needed support staff. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Still he said nothing. That was when Vivian decided to mention Alexandra. The name landed in the conversation like a stone dropped into still water, sending quiet ripples around the table. Vivian said it casually, as if she were commenting on the weather or the soup. She mentioned running into Alexandra the previous week, said she was doing wonderfully, that her family's business was thriving. I watched Marcus closely. Something flickered across his face, guilt perhaps or nervousness, but it vanished before I could name it. Patricia seized the moment with barely disguised enthusiasm. She said Alexandra had always been such a lovely girl, so accomplished, so perfectly suited to their family's lifestyle. She added that Alexandra had been Marcus's girlfriend for 3 years. Had I known that? I said I hadn't. Patricia smiled and said it was such a shame when they'd parted ways. Everyone had expected them to end up together. Alexandra's family owned an import company specializing in luxury vehicles, such a perfect complement to the Whitmore dealerships. The message was unmistakable. Alexandra had been the right choice. I was not. As I absorbed this, I noticed the photographs lining the wall behind me. I turned slightly in my chair and saw a curated gallery of family milestones, Christmases, birthdays, graduations. And in at least 4 of those photos a beautiful dark-haired woman stood beside Marcus, her arm linked through his, her smile radiant. Alexandra. Patricia followed my gaze and said nothing, but her satisfaction was almost tangible. Vivian twisted the knife further. She remarked that Alexandra was still single. It was surprising, really, no one had claimed her yet. Almost as if she were waiting for something. Or someone. I turned back to the table and smiled. I said she sounded like a remarkable woman. This was clearly not the response Vivian had anticipated. She blinked momentarily, thrown off balance. Patricia recovered first. She agreed, yes, Alexandra was remarkable. Then, with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, she added that she hoped I wouldn't feel too out of place in their world given my more modest background. I asked her what she meant by modest. Patricia's smile sharpened. She said she understood that not everyone was born with certain advantages, that some people had to work ordinary jobs and live ordinary lives. There was no shame in being common, she said. Common. The word landed hard. I felt something shift inside me, but I kept my expression carefully neutral. I had come here to learn the truth about these people, and that truth was revealing itself with brutal clarity. Marcus finally spoke. He said his mother hadn't meant anything by it, that she was only being protective of him. Patricia patted his hand and replied sweetly that of course she was. Every mother wants the best for her son. The unspoken ending to that sentence hung in the air like smoke. And you are not the best. Harold cleared his throat and attempted to steer the conversation elsewhere. He asked about my hobbies, whether I had interests outside of work. I said I enjoyed reading, hiking, and cooking simple meals, nothing elaborate. Vivian laughed. She said it was adorable, like listening to a child list her favorite pastimes. Richard, the family friend, spoke for the first time since we'd sat down. He said there was something to be said for simple pleasures, that his own grandmother had lived modestly and had been the happiest person he'd ever known. Patricia shot him a look sharp enough to curdle milk. Richard ignored it. He continued watching me with that same searching expression and asked what my grandmother's name had been. Margaret Graham, I replied. Richard's eyebrows lifted slightly. He didn't say anything else, just nodded thoughtfully and returned to his soup. The rest of dinner unfolded much the same way. Patricia and Vivian took turns asking questions designed to remind me of my place, one they clearly believed was far beneath theirs. Marcus made occasional half-hearted attempts to intervene, but his defense lacked conviction. Harold remained mostly silent, observing everything with the weary resignation of a man who had long ago learned that arguing with his wife was pointless. And throughout it all, Richard watched me. By the time dessert arrived, I knew everything I needed to know about the Whitmore family. They were snobs of the highest order, the kind who measured human worth in bank balances and social connections. To them I was an inconvenience, an obstacle to be removed, a mistake Marcus had made and needed to correct. But I had learned something else too. Something I hadn't expected. Marcus was not the man I thought he was. The Marcus I had fallen in love with was kind, attentive, and genuinely interested in me as a person. But this Marcus, the one sitting at his mother's table allowing her to dismantle me piece by piece without real protest, was someone else entirely. Someone weaker. Someone who valued his family's approval more than standing up for the woman he claimed to love. I wondered which version of Marcus was real. I was about to find out. After dessert, Patricia announced that we would move to the sitting room for coffee. The men drifted toward the windows to talk business while Vivian excused herself to take a phone call. Patricia said she needed to speak with the housekeeper and would join us shortly. That left me alone, with my thoughts and a perfect opportunity. I excused myself to find the bathroom. Marcus pointed me toward the back of the house, down a long hallway lined with even more pretentious artwork. I walked slowly, absorbing the details. From a purely financial perspective, the house was impressive. Emotionally, it felt cold and hollow, more museum than home. The bathroom was easy to find, but it wasn't what I was actually searching for. I was looking for answers. For clarity. For something that would help me make sense of the evening. I found something far better. As I passed a partially open door, I heard voices, Patricia's and Vivian's. I stopped. Every instinct told me to keep moving, to respect their privacy, not to eavesdrop like a character in a soap opera. But there was something in Patricia's voice that made me pause. Something sharp. Urgent. I stepped closer, staying in the shadows. Patricia was saying they needed to deal with this situation quickly, that Marcus could not be allowed to make such a mistake. Vivian agreed. She said she couldn't believe he'd actually brought me here, that she'd assumed this was just another phase, like his vegetarian stint in college. Patricia replied that this was far more serious than a diet. This woman could ruin everything. My heart began to pound. They were talking about me. Of course they were. But what came next made my blood run cold. Vivian said the timing couldn't be worse. They needed the merger with the Castellano family to go through, and for that to happen Marcus needed to be with Alexandra. Castellano. Alexandra's family. The luxury car importers. Patricia agreed. She said the dealerships were in trouble, that without the Castellano partnership they wouldn't survive the next fiscal year. The floor seemed to shift beneath me. The Whitmore dealerships were in financial distress. I'd suspected as much from my research, but hearing it confirmed sent a jolt through me. Vivian went on. She said Marcus was supposed to keep Alexandra interested while they finalized the details. That had always been the plan. Alexandra's family would invest in the dealerships and in return they'd gain access to the Whitmore distribution network. Patricia added that Marcus had assured her he was keeping his options open with Alexandra. Options open. While he was proposing to me. I leaned against the wall, my mind racing. This wasn't just snobbery. It wasn't simply a wealthy family disapproving of their son's girlfriend. This was calculated. Strategic. Marcus wasn't just weak. He was using me. But for what? If Alexandra was always the endgame, why keep me around at all? Vivian answered my unspoken question. She said Marcus was such a fool. He had actually started to like this little secretary. This nobody. Marcus was supposed to use her as a placeholder until the deal with Alexandra was finalized, but he was getting attached. A placeholder. That was what I was. A distraction. Someone to keep Marcus occupied while his family finalized their business arrangements. Patricia said they would take care of it. They would announce the engagement that very night, publicly binding Marcus to me, and then find a way to end it before the wedding. Once Alexandra was secured, they would conveniently uncover some terrible secret about me, something that would justify calling off the engagement. Vivian asked what terrible secret. Patricia replied that they would invent one if they had to. I stood frozen in the hallway listening as two women calmly planned the destruction of my relationship, discussing it with the same casual tone one might use to plan a dinner party. Then Vivian said something that made it worse. At least the girl was too stupid to suspect anything. Marcus had chosen well in that regard. She was naive. Trusting. Probably just grateful that someone like Marcus had noticed her at all. Patricia laughed and agreed. I stepped away from the door and moved silently down the hall. My hands were shaking, but not from pain. From anger. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was naive. They thought I was so desperate for love that I'd accept whatever scraps they chose to throw my way. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I found the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection. The woman looking back at me wasn't broken. She wasn't devastated. She was thinking. I had come here to test Marcus's family, and they had failed, spectacularly. But the test had revealed something far more important than their cruelty. Marcus himself was part of the problem. He wasn't just caught between me and his family. He was actively deceiving me. Now the question was what to do about it. I could confront him. I could walk back into that room and tell everyone exactly what I'd heard. I could create a scene, expose their plans, and leave this house forever. But that would be too easy. Too fast. They would dismiss me as emotional. Dramatic. Bitter. They would convince themselves that I was only proving their assumptions about me. No. If I was going to respond to this betrayal, I would do it my way, on my terms, with a plan they would never see coming. My grandmother had taught me many things, but one lesson mattered above all else. When someone underestimates you, they give you a gift, the gift of surprise. Patricia and Vivian had just given me the greatest gift of all. They had no idea what I was capable of. I fixed my makeup, smoothed my hair, and returned to the sitting room with a pleasant smile. The game was just beginning. When I stepped back into the room, something had changed. The furniture had been subtly rearranged, the lighting carefully adjusted. Patricia stood by the fireplace, her anticipation barely concealed. Harold positioned himself near the doorway looking uneasy. Vivian pretended to study a painting, though I caught her glancing at Marcus with a knowing smirk. And Marcus stood at the center of the room, visibly nervous. Too nervous. He turned when I entered, his face splitting into what was meant to be a loving smile. He crossed the room, took my hands in his, and said there was something he wanted to ask me. I felt the trap begin to close. Marcus said he knew we hadn't been together very long and that his family could be overwhelming at first, but he said he knew what he wanted. He said he wanted me. Then he dropped to one knee. The ring he produced was large and ostentatious, exactly the kind of thing Patricia would approve of. Up close, though, its quality was questionable. The diamond was cloudy, the setting uneven. It was the sort of ring that looked impressive in soft lighting but revealed its flaws under scrutiny, much like the man holding it. Marcus asked me to marry him. Behind him, Patricia beamed. This was clearly the plan, the first step in their strategy. Bind Marcus to me publicly, then dispose of me later. In the meantime, the engagement would keep Alexandra waiting, her future dangling, while the family finalized their business arrangements. I understood all of this in the space of a heartbeat. I also understood that I had a choice. I could say no. I could refuse a proposal from a man who was using me in front of a family who despised me. I could walk out with my dignity intact and never see any of them again. But that would end the story too soon. I thought about what I'd heard in the hallway. About their plans to invent a scandal. About how they saw me as stupid, naive, disposable. And I thought about how satisfying it would be to show them exactly how wrong they were. So I said yes. Marcus slid the ring onto my finger and Patricia began applauding as though she were watching a stage performance. Vivian offered her congratulations with all the warmth of a January morning in Alaska. Harold shook Marcus's hand and told him he'd done well. Across the room, Richard caught my eye. There was something knowing in his expression, an awareness perhaps that this story was far from over. I smiled at him. He smiled back. The rest of the evening blurred into champagne and hollow congratulations. Patricia launched into engagement party planning. Vivian debated venues. Harold spoke vaguely about business opportunities that might arise from the union of our families, stumbling slightly as he did, clearly uncertain what my family could possibly bring to the table. Marcus stayed close to me for the rest of the evening, playing the part of the devoted fiancé with surprising conviction. If I hadn't overheard his mother and sister, I might have believed every word of it. But I had heard, and I would never forget. When the night finally came to an end, Marcus walked me out to my car. The air was cold and clear, and for a moment we stood there in the driveway facing each other in silence. He asked if I was all right. He said he knew his family could be overwhelming but promised they would warm up to me in time. I told him I understood. I said I was just tired. He kissed me goodnight and I drove away from the Whitmore estate with his ring on my finger and a plan beginning to take shape in my mind. The next morning I began my research. If there's one thing my job has taught me, it's the power of information, data, documentation patterns. I spend my days analyzing systems, identifying weaknesses, and optimizing solutions. I was about to apply those same skills to the Whitmore family. What I uncovered over the next few days confirmed everything I'd overheard, and then some. The Whitmore dealerships were in serious financial trouble. This wasn't a temporary setback, it was a structural crisis. They had expanded too aggressively during the boom years, taken on massive debt, and now the consequences were catching up with them. Their primary franchise agreement was up for renewal and the manufacturer was quietly considering other partners. The proposed partnership with Alexandra's family wasn't strategic. It was desperate. But that wasn't all. As I dug deeper, I found something else, something the Whitmores likely believed was buried forever. Vivian had been embezzling from the family business. At first the amounts were small, hidden in inflated expense reports and petty cash accounts. Over time they added up. Hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned off to bankroll her lifestyle while the company struggled to stay afloat. I printed everything, legal filings, financial statements, transaction records flagged for irregularities, and then I started making phone calls. My grandmother's name still carried weight in certain circles. The business relationships she'd built over decades hadn't been forgotten. When I reached out, people listened. One of those contacts knew Richard Hartley. And Richard, as it turned out, had his own history with the Whitmore family. Years earlier they'd cheated him out of a business deal, nothing illegal, just unethical enough to leave a lasting bitterness. He'd been waiting for the right moment to settle the score. I was about to give him that moment. Before I go on, I want to say this from the heart. This channel means more to me than I can express, and every like, comment, and subscription truly helps. If you're enjoying the story, please take just a couple of seconds to hit the subscribe button, it makes a real difference. Thank you. Now back to what happened next. The weeks that followed were an exercise in patience and performance. I played the role of the blissfully engaged fiancé with the skill of a seasoned actress. I attended family dinners at the Whitmore estate. I listened to Patricia's passive-aggressive comments with a polite smile. I watched Vivian flaunt her designer clothes and dripping jewelry, fully aware of where the money had come from. And I watched Marcus. He was different now, or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time. The attentiveness I had once found charming now felt calculated. His compliments sounded rehearsed. His phone, which he guarded with increasing vigilance, buzzed constantly, and he immediately hid the messages from view. I knew who was texting him. I had seen the name flash across the screen more than once. Alexandra. One evening I told Marcus I would be working late. Instead, I parked near the restaurant where he was supposedly meeting a client. He wasn't meeting a client. He was meeting her. I watched through the window as they sat together at a corner table, their heads leaning close, their body language unmistakably intimate. He took her hand across the table. She laughed at something he said and touched his face. I took photographs, not because I needed evidence for legal purposes, but because I wanted to remember. To remember exactly who Marcus Whitmore really was. He wasn't just weak. He wasn't just a mama's boy. He was a liar. A cheat. Actively maintaining two relationships while his family orchestrated the outcome behind the scenes. The rage I felt in that moment was white-hot, purifying, but I didn't act on it. Not yet. Instead, I went home and added the photos to my growing file. Richard and I had been meeting regularly, always in secret. He had his own evidence of the Whitmore's shady business dealings, and he knew people they had hurt over the years. He was more than willing to help bring them down. But he asked me why. He said he understood his own motivations, but he wanted to know mine. Was this about revenge, or was it something more? I thought about it for a long moment before answering. I said it wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. The Whitmores had spent their lives using money and status to manipulate people. They treated anyone beneath them as disposable. They were raising Marcus to be the same way, and they would continue doing it long after I was gone. Someone needed to show them that money couldn't shield them from consequences. Richard nodded slowly. Your grandmother would be proud, he said. That was the moment I knew I had made the right choice. The engagement party was set for 3 weeks later. The Whitmores were hosting it at their estate, inviting everyone who mattered in the business world. Patricia was treating it like a coronation, an opportunity to showcase her perfect family. She had no idea what was coming. I spent those 3 weeks preparing. I coordinated with Richard, made strategic calls to industry contacts, and even reached out to the car manufacturer, considering whether to drop the Whitmore dealerships. They were very interested in what I had to share. Then the night before the party, I did one last thing. I gave Marcus a final chance to be honest. We were sitting in his apartment going over last-minute details for the party. I asked Marcus casually how he felt about us, about our future. He said he was excited. That he couldn't wait to marry me. I asked if there was anything he wanted to tell me, anything at all. He looked at me with those blue eyes I had once found so charming. There's nothing, he said. You're everything I've ever wanted. I asked about Alexandra. His face went pale. Just for a second, but I saw it. Fear. He recovered quickly. Alexandra's just an old friend, he said. Nothing more. I nodded. And in that moment I understood. I understood that Marcus would never tell me the truth. He would lie to my face for as long as it suited him. He was his mother's son through and through. The next evening I put on a dress from my real closet, not the modest navy number I had worn to that first dinner. This was designer elegant, worth more than everything Patricia was wearing combined. I looked in the mirror and smiled. It was time to show the Whitmore family exactly who they had underestimated. The Whitmore estate had been transformed for the engagement party. White tents dotted the manicured lawn. Crystal chandeliers hung from temporary structures, scattering prismatic light across the gathering crowd. A string quartet played tasteful classical music near the fountain. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more per bite than some people earned in an hour. Patricia had outdone herself. This wasn't just a party, it was a statement. I pulled up in my usual Subaru, watching the valets' expressions as they struggled to reconcile my modest vehicle with the parade of Mercedes and BMWs that had preceded me. One actually asked if I was with the catering company. I smiled and handed him my keys. The walk from the parking area to the main tent felt like a runway. With every step I shed the persona I had been wearing for the past 3 weeks, the nervous girlfriend, the grateful fiancé, the simple woman who should be thankful for Patricia Whitmore's grudging acceptance. Tonight I was Ella Graham, the real one. My dress was a deep emerald green, custom fitted by a designer whose name was whispered in fashion circles with reverence. My jewelry was understated yet unmistakably valuable to anyone who knew quality. My grandmother's diamond pendant hung at my throat, a piece appraised at more than most cars cost. My watch was a limited edition, one of only 50 in the world. For the past 14 months I had hidden who I was. Tonight I wouldn't. Tonight I would stop hiding. The first person to notice me was a woman I didn't recognize, someone's wife or girlfriend standing near the entrance to the main tent. She did a double take, whispered something to her companion, and both of them stared as I walked past. The second person to notice was Harold Whitmore. He was greeting guests near the bar, performing his duties with the weary enthusiasm of a man who would rather be watching golf. When he saw me, his practiced smile froze. His eyes roamed from my face to my dress to my jewelry and back again. Confusion replaced his usual polished hospitality. "Good evening," I said, my voice calm. "Thank you for hosting such a lovely party." He stammered something about being glad I could make it, still trying to solve the puzzle I had become. I moved on before he could ask another question. The main tent was filled with perhaps 100 guests, a carefully curated mix of business associates, society figures, and family friends. I recognized several faces from my research: the regional manager from the car manufacturer, competing dealership owners, a journalist from the local business publication. And there, holding court near the champagne fountain, was Patricia Whitmore. She wore a cream-colored gown that had probably cost a small fortune, though its off-the-rack nature betrayed her efforts to disguise it. Her jewelry was impressive by normal standards, but modest next to true wealth. She laughed at something one of her guests had said, head thrown back in that practiced way that spoke of finishing school training and feigned amusement. She hadn't seen me yet. I collected a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and moved through the crowd, stopping to introduce myself to several guests along the way. Each interaction followed the same pattern: initial confusion at my appearance, surprise when I mentioned I was Marcus' fiancé, renewed bafflement when my dress, jewelry, and poise didn't match the image they had been fed. Word spread quickly. I saw it in whispered exchanges, sidelong glances, subtle phone checks, everyone trying to figure out who I really was. Good. I finally reached Patricia's circle just as she was finishing a story about her recent charity work. She turned to greet the newcomer with her usual frozen smile. Then something remarkable happened. Her face transformed, first confusion, then recognition, then disbelief, and perhaps even fear. She said my name like a question. "Good evening, Patricia," I replied smoothly. "And thank you for throwing such a beautiful party." Her eyes darted over every detail of my appearance: the dress that likely cost more than her monthly household budget, the pendant that had graced the pages of a jewelry magazine, the watch she had probably only ever seen in advertisements. Patricia's voice was carefully controlled, but a tremor betrayed her. "Where did you get these things?" she asked. I smiled lightly. Just a few pieces I've been saving for a special occasion. Vivian appeared at her mother's side as if summoned by some invisible alarm. Her eyes scanned me and her expression mirrored Patricia's, confusion, recognition, disbelief. But Vivian recovered faster. Interesting dress, she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. Is it a rental? I told her the designer's name. He's a friend. He made this specifically for me. The name hit Vivian like a physical blow. This was someone who dressed celebrities with a waiting list years long, someone who didn't make gowns for administrative assistants struggling to pay rent. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I excused myself and began looking for Marcus. As I walked away, I caught Patricia hissing something to Vivian about finding out what's going on, and Vivian's confused reply, I don't understand. This doesn't make any sense. I smiled quietly to myself and kept walking. The first phase of the evening was complete. The seed of doubt had been planted. Now it was time to let it grow. Marcus found me before I found him. He emerged from a cluster of guests near the bar, face pale, eyes wide. He had clearly heard the whispers, seen the glances, and was struggling to reconcile the woman standing before him with the image he thought he knew. What's going on? He asked, voice tight. Where did you get the dress, the jewelry, the whole transformation? Why do you look like a completely different person? I looked like myself, I said simply. I watched something shift behind his eyes, the first crack in a wall he had spent years building to hide an uncomfortable truth. He asked if we could talk privately. I shook my head. Later, I said. This is our engagement party, after all. We have guests to attend to. Before he could protest, I took his arm and steered him toward a group of business associates, men and women who ran the automotive industry in our region, whose opinions actually mattered to the Whitmore dealership's survival. They had been watching my entrance with undisguised curiosity. I introduced myself properly this time. Full name, Ella Graham. I mentioned my position at my company. Their expressions changed as the recognition set in. One silver-haired man who ran a competing dealership chain leaned forward. I've heard of you, he said. My nephew works in tech. He's mentioned your name in connection with some innovative software solutions. That's very kind of him, I replied smoothly. Another guest, a woman in mergers and acquisitions at a major investment firm, raised her eyebrows. Are you related to Margaret Graham? She was my grandmother, I said. The woman's eyes widened. Your grandmother was a remarkable businesswoman. And in that moment I saw the Whitmore's carefully constructed image of superiority begin to crumble piece by piece. The Graham name still carries significant weight in certain financial circles, the woman said. I could feel Marcus tensing beside me. He had no idea what any of this meant. He'd never asked about my family beyond the most superficial questions. He'd assumed that poor meant unimportant, and he had never bothered to look deeper. His mistake. The evening continued, and with each conversation the truth spread further. People were whispering, checking their phones, confirming details. The narrative was shifting beneath the Whitmore's feet, and they didn't know how to stop it. About an hour into the party, Richard arrived. He found me near the rose garden, momentarily alone, while Marcus was pulled away by his father for some urgent discussion. The manufacturer's representative is here, Richard said. He's very interested in the documentation I shared with him earlier this week. Is he ready? I asked. Ready? I've been ready for years, he replied. We went over the details one last time, fine-tuning every step. Then Richard melted back into the crowd, and I returned to my role as the smiling, happy fiancé. Patricia found me next. She had regained some composure, though the strain around her eyes betrayed her. She grabbed my arm, too firmly, and demanded to know what I was doing. What do you mean? I asked innocently. You know exactly what I mean, she spat. The dress, the jewelry, the stories about your grandmother, your job, what's your game? I looked her in the eye. There's no game, I said. I'm simply being myself. That's impossible, she hissed. Marcus told me about your circumstances. A secretary living in a studio apartment, driving a car that belongs in a junkyard. Marcus made certain assumptions, I said. I never actually told him those things. Patricia's face went completely still. I work in tech, I said calmly. I have a support role. True, since as a software architect I supported development teams. I never claimed to be poor, I added. I simply never corrected their assumptions. She asked why. I smiled and met her gaze. My grandmother taught me that a person's true character only shows when they think no one important is watching, I said. I wanted to know who the Whitmore family really was. Patricia's face drained of color. Now I know, I said. Before she could respond, the string quartet stopped playing. Harold Whitmore's voice boomed over the speaker system announcing that it was time for the official toasts and speeches. Patricia looked at me, something akin to fear flickering across her features. I smiled confident and walked toward the stage. The main event was about to begin. At the far end of the tent a stage had been set up adorned with flowers and soft lighting meant to feel romantic, but now it felt like a spotlight waiting for its moment. Harold took the microphone welcoming guests and thanking them for coming to celebrate this special occasion. And all eyes would soon be on me. Harold spoke first about family tradition and the importance of strong partnerships, both in business and in life. His eyes kept flicking to Patricia, who was moving through the crowd toward the stage with the precision and focus of a general surveying a battlefield. She reached the microphone just as Harold concluded, taking over seamlessly. Her composure was flawless, her smile perfectly frozen. She welcomed everyone to the celebration of her son's engagement, praising Marcus for finding a wonderful young woman who would be an ideal addition to the Whitmore family. She spoke of exciting plans for the future, promising that the Whitmore legacy would continue for generations. Then came the business hints. Growth. Expansion. Strategic partnerships. New opportunities. The Whitmore dealerships were entering a bold, promising chapter. I noticed the manufacturer's representative shift uneasily in his seat and saw Richard catch his eye, giving a subtle nod. Patricia was building towards something, using this engagement party as a stage for a business announcement likely tied to the Castellano merger she hoped would rescue the family company. She called Marcus to the stage. He climbed the steps, nervously hiding it behind a practiced smile, searching the crowd until his gaze found me. His expression was conflicted. Patricia stepped aside and said there was one more person who should join them. Our future daughter-in-law, she said, the woman who has captured Marcus' heart. She said my name. All eyes turned toward me. I set down my champagne glass and walked forward. The tent fell silent except for the sound of my footsteps. Every gaze followed me. The whispers had done their work. Everyone knew this engagement party was about to shift to become something entirely different. I climbed the steps and stood beside Marcus. He reached for my hand, but his grip wavered. Patricia handed me the microphone, smiling, but her eyes betrayed tension. I'm sure you'd like to say a few words, she said. I held the microphone, glanced at Marcus, then at Patricia, who still thought she controlled the evening. My eyes swept across the crowd, people who could influence the future of the Whitmore empire. Yes, I said. I do want to say a few words. I began. I want to thank Patricia for the warm welcome she has given me, I said, letting the words hang. And I want to acknowledge the Whitmore family for showing me exactly who they are over the past few weeks. Patricia's smile faltered. When I first came to this house, I continued, my voice steady, I made a decision. I chose to let the Whitmores see a simple version of me, a woman without expensive clothes or impressive credentials, a woman they might consider beneath their notice. The crowd was utterly silent. I wanted to see how the Whitmores would treat someone they thought couldn't help them. I began, my voice steady, someone they believed had nothing to offer, someone they thought was, in Patricia's words, common. Patricia's face went pale. What I discovered, I continued, was illuminating. I recounted the dinner where I had been compared unfavorably to Marcus's ex-girlfriend. I described the whispered insults Patricia thought I couldn't hear. I spoke of being called the help, being called common, being called a gold digger by people who knew nothing about me. Marcus stared at me, his face a mask of horror. And then I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear, I said, my voice rising slightly. I described the conversation in the study. I described Vivian and Patricia plotting how to remove me from Marcus's life. I revealed that I had been nothing more than a placeholder, someone to occupy Marcus while the family orchestrated his real future with Alexandra Castellano. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I discovered that the Whitmore dealerships are in serious financial trouble, I said. I learned they are desperate for a merger with the Castano family just to survive. I let my words sink in before continuing. And I discovered that Marcus has been keeping his options open with Alexandra the entire time we were together. I pulled out my phone showing a photograph to the audience. Marcus and Alexandra at a restaurant holding hands across the table. This, I said, was taken 2 weeks ago while Marcus was supposedly working late. The crowd erupted into whispers. Marcus grabbed my arm, panic in his eyes. This isn't what it looks like, he stammered. I can explain. I already gave you a chance to explain, I said firmly. You chose to lie. I turned back to the crowd, letting Marcus sink into silence. There's more. The tent fell completely silent again. Every person there understood that the usual rules of society events had been suspended. The masks were coming off. I spent the past few weeks researching the Whitmore family business, I said. And I found some interesting things. I detailed the financial records, the overextended credit, declining sales, and the franchise agreement that was on the verge of termination. Harold Whitmore's face had gone gray. And there's something more serious, I said, locking eyes with Vivian, frozen at the back of the tent like a deer in headlights. Vivian Whitmore has been embezzling from the family company for years. The amount started small, but over time they've grown into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Vivian's husband turned toward her in shock. Vivian shouted, "That's a lie. You have no proof. You're just a bitter woman trying to destroy our family." Richard stepped forward from the crowd, calm but resolute. He carried a thick folder, the evidence I had coordinated with him to gather, years of bank records, expense reports, and transaction histories, all the documentation needed to prove exactly what Vivian had done. The room held its breath. Richard handed the folder to the manufacturer's representative, who had moved closer to the stage, his expression confirming the worst suspicions he had been harboring. "I've been waiting a long time for this moment," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. 15 years ago the Whitmores cheated me on a business deal. I never forgot. When Ella approached me with evidence of their current misdeeds, I was more than happy to contribute what I knew. Patricia found her voice at last shrill with outrage. "This is preposterous," she said. "You have no right to make these accusations. I will sue you for defamation." I met her gaze steadily. "You are welcome to try," I said. "Everything I have presented is documented and verifiable. The financial records are public information accessible to anyone who knows where to look. The evidence of Vivian's embezzlement has been compiled from sources that would stand in any court of law." I glanced at Marcus, still frozen beside me, a man whose entire world was collapsing. "There's one more thing," I said. I lifted my hand and removed the engagement ring from my finger. The cloudy diamond caught the light, revealing every flaw. "I will not be marrying Marcus Whitmore," I said. "I never intended to. Not after I learned the truth about him and his family. The only reason I said yes was to give them enough rope to hang themselves." I handed the ring back to Marcus. "You should give this to Alexandra," I said. "She's clearly the one you really want." Marcus's face crumpled. "That's not true," he stammered. "I have feelings for you. The thing with Alexandra, that was just business. My mother arranged it." "Exactly," I said, my voice cutting. "That's the problem. You let your mother arrange your life, your relationships, your future. You never once stood up for me when your family attacked me. You lied to my face about Alexandra even when I gave you a chance to tell the truth. A man who cannot be honest with the woman he claims to love is not a man I want to marry." The crowd was utterly silent. Every eye was on us. I turned to face them one last time. "I am Ella Graham," I said, my voice clear and unwavering. "I am a senior software architect who built a career through hard work and integrity. I make more in a month than most people earn in a year. And I live simply because my grandmother taught me that wealth does not measure a person's worth. The Whitmores," I continued, "have shown me their true character. They judge others by bank accounts and social status. They treated me with contempt because they thought I had nothing to offer. That is the kind of character that will eventually destroy them, with or without my help. I set the microphone down on the podium and walked off the stage. The crowd parted for me like water. No one spoke. No one tried to stop me. Behind me the chaos began a rising tide of panic and disbelief. I didn't look back as I walked through the tent, but I could hear everything, the sharp high-pitched urgency in Patricia's voice, desperate to salvage what was already ruined. She was insisting there had been some misunderstanding, claiming I was disturbed, insisting none of what I had said was true. But it was too late, the damage was done. I could hear the manufacturer's representative speaking into his phone, clipped and professional, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Guests murmured among themselves, some already making their way to the exits, eager to distance themselves from the disaster that had unfolded. At the edge of the tent I paused. Vivian had cornered her husband near the bar, trying to explain, to justify, but his expression was carved from stone. He looked at her as if he'd never truly seen her before, as if the woman he had married had been replaced by a stranger wearing her face. Harold sat slumped in a chair, his head in his hands, the patriarch of the Whitmore empire, brought low by secrets he had perhaps always suspected but never dared to confront. And Marcus. Marcus stood alone on the stage, the rejected engagement ring still clutched in his hand. He stared at me, an expression I couldn't read, anger, grief, regret. It didn't matter anymore. I stepped out of the tent and into the cool night air. The stars shone above, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill my lungs, feeling lighter, freer, somehow unburdened. A few minutes later Richard found me by the fountain. "It's done," he said. "The manufacturer has already made the call. The Whitmore dealerships will lose their franchise agreement by the end of the month." I asked if he felt satisfied. "Not satisfied," he said. "Relieved, more like a debt that's finally been paid." I understood exactly what he meant. He asked what I would do now. "I'll go home," I said. "I'll sleep well tonight for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow I'll wake up and continue building the life I've created for myself, the life that has nothing to do with Marcus Whitmore or his family." Richard nodded. "Your grandmother would have been proud tonight," he said. Unexpected tears pricked at my eyes. "I hope so," I murmured. He handed me a business card. "If you ever need anything, call me. I owe you one." I tucked the card into my purse and thanked him. I walked to the valet station, collected my old Subaru from a very confused attendant, and drove away from the Whitmore estate for the last time. In the rearview mirror I watched guests streaming from the tent, the party collapsing into chaos. Patricia gestured wildly, still trying, and failing, to control a narrative that had long since slipped from her grasp. I turned my eyes back to the road and didn't look back again. The drive home was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't call anyone. I just drove through the night, letting the miles stretch between me and everything that had happened. When I finally reached my modest apartment, I sat in the car for a long moment before stepping inside. I thought about Marcus, the man I had believed him to be and the man he had truly shown himself to be. I thought about how close I had come to marrying him, to tying my life to his, to becoming part of a family that would have treated me with contempt forever. I thought about my grandmother and the lesson she had instilled in me about character, integrity, and worth. And I thought about the future, my future, the one I would build for myself on my own terms, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not what I could give them. I went inside. My apartment was small, simple, just the way I liked it. I made myself a cup of tea, changed out of my designer dress, and sat by the window in my worn, comfortable robe. The city lights sparkled below, thousands of lives unfolding behind thousands of windows. I was just one of them. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary, and that was exactly how I wanted it. A week later I was sitting at my kitchen table with my morning coffee when my phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline read, "Whitmore Automotive faces closure after franchise termination." I read the article slowly, absorbing every detail. The manufacturer had officially ended its partnership with the Whitmore dealerships, citing concerns over financial management and ethical practices. Without the franchise agreement, the dealerships couldn't sell new vehicles. Without new vehicle sales, the business couldn't survive. The article mentioned former business partners coming forward with complaints about the Whitmore family's conduct. It noted an internal investigation had uncovered financial irregularities now under review by authorities. It reported that Vivian Whitmore had been asked to step down from her position pending further inquiry. It didn't mention me. I had asked Richard to keep my name out of the story, and he had honored that request. The spotlight was on the Whitmores and their own misdeeds, not on the woman who had exposed them. I didn't want fame or recognition. I just wanted the truth to come out, and it had. I finished my coffee and looked around my small kitchen, the same kitchen I had sat in a month ago the morning I first drove to the Whitmore estate to meet Marcus's family. The same kitchen where I had decided to test them to see who they really were beneath their polished surface. So much had changed since then, and yet so much had stayed exactly the same. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Marcus. He said he needed to see me. He said he could explain everything. He said he had made mistakes, but that he still cared about me. He asked if we could meet for coffee, just to talk. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without replying. Some doors once closed are meant to stay closed. I stood and walked to the window, watching the morning sun rise over the city. It was going to be a beautiful day, a day for new beginnings, for moving forward, for building something better. My grandmother's pendant rested warm against my chest. I touched it lightly, thinking of the woman who had taught me everything I knew about character and worth. She had lived her life simply, not because she had to, but because she understood that the things that truly matter can't be bought: love, integrity, self-respect, and the knowledge that you have acted according to your principles even when compromise would have been easier. The Whitmores had thought money and status could carry them through life. They had believed they were entitled to treat people however they wished without consequence. They had been wrong. I turned from the window and got ready for work, my regular job at my regular company, doing the work I loved with people who respected me for my skills and character, not my bank account. The story of the Whitmore family would continue to unfold in the coming weeks and months. There would be investigations, legal proceedings, consequences, and repercussions. The empire they had built on arrogance and deception would crumble piece by piece. But that was their story. My story was just beginning, and it would be written on my terms and my words according to my values. That was the lesson my grandmother had passed down. That truth had guided me through every moment of the past month. A person's worth is not measured by their bank account, social standing, or the approval of people like Patricia Whitmore. It is measured by character, by the choices one makes when no one is watching, and by the way one treats those who can do nothing for them. The Whitmores had failed that test completely. And I had finally found the answer I had been searching for. The answer was simple: I didn't need their approval. I didn't need Marcus's love. I didn't need anyone's validation to know my own worth. I already knew who I was, and that was enough.